Hello Zer0 Books patrons. This video is the second in a new series of patron-first videos on communism. It is being released in the middle of July for our patrons, and the basis of this series is the 1970 book Communism by Professor Emile B. Ader, who was the chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Arkansas. Professor Ader appears to have been a level-headed anti-communist. His book, Communism, represents his attempt to push past the irrational fears that had gripped the U.S. public and policymakers both, in order to assess the ideology rationally. It was an attempt to produce a relatively honest and fairly comprehensive account of communism from a rational anti-communist perspective. In this series, we'll discover whether or not we can overcome Ader's Cold War interpretation of communism as we search for something in the word that is worth reviving and developing further.
We may be on the way to realizing one of our fondest dreams.
When we left off, we were considering the list of proto-communists that Ader provided in his first chapter of his book. We just left off with the English Civil War and the true levelers or diggers. Moving on through Ader's book, we find that he mentions the Utopian Socialists next. Specifically, Ader writes, other theorists of prominence living and writing in the late 18th and early 19th century include the Englishmen William Goodwin and Robert Owen, and the Frenchmen Etienne Cabet, Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. To begin, I want to spend a little bit of time on Goodwin in order to demonstrate how socialism and communism can be interpreted as having developed out of the history of Christianity. William Goodwin was born March 3, 1756, and died on April 7, 1836. His father, John Goodwin, was a Protestant nonconformist, a Calvinist.
We're going to examine the same mystery twice. First, as a Christian legend.
The fact that Goodwin was born into a religious community that had broken with Catholicism, and with the Anglican Church as well, already put him on what I'll call the left side of history. From the broadest perspective, the Protestants should be considered fellow travelers with Marx. That is, from a Marxist perspective, the Reformation was a necessary step along the way to freedom, if not a sufficient one. Here's what Karl Marx had to say about that old rebel monk, Martin Luther. Just as Luther recognized religion as the substance of the external world, and in consequence stood opposed to Catholic paganism, just as he superseded external religiosity by making religiosity the inner substance of man, just as he negated the priests outside the layman because he transplanted the priest into laymen's hearts, just so with wealth. Wealth is something outside man and independent of him, and therefore is something to be maintained and asserted only in an external fashion, is done away with. That is, this external, mindless objectivity of wealth is done away with private property being incorporated in man himself, and with man himself being recognized as its essence. But as a result, man is brought within the orbit of private property, just as with Luther, he is brought within the orbit of religion. Under the semblance of recognizing man, the political economy whose principle is labor rather carries to its logical conclusion the denial of man, since man himself no longer stands in an external relation of tension to the external substance of private property, but has himself become this tense essence of private property. What was previously being external to oneself, man's actual externalization, has merely become the act of externalizing, the process of alienating. What Marx was getting at is probably best understood through his critique of Feuerbach. Feuerbach claimed that the image of God It was merely mankind's best qualities projected upon the heavens, and he argued that by eliminating superstitious beliefs in God, mankind would realize himself. Marx, on the other hand, objected. As humanity was responsible for its own conditions, it was also responsible for creating conditions wherein this projection was necessary. Eliminating the idea of God would not eliminate the need for God. It would not change the material conditions that necessitated that men serve God through serving the priest, for instance. Still, this Feuerbachian atheism was a necessary first step towards freedom, and Calvin went further in the direction of Feuerbach than Luther had. For example, Calvin rejected both the doctrine of transubstantiation and the doctrine from Luther of illocal presence. According to Keith Matheson, professor of theology at the Reformation Bible College in Sanford, Florida, Calvin's interpretation of the rite of communion, or the Lord's Supper, claims the Eucharist miracle is caused by the congregation's faith rather than by God's presence. Quote, medieval scholastic theologians had distinguished various modes of presence or ways of being present. They used the term local presence to describe the way in which physical, finite things are present in a circumscribed place. Spiritual presence described the way in which spiritual beings, such as angels, souls, or God, are present. Because this term was somewhat vague, other terms were used in order to be more specific. Illocal presence, for example, described the way in which finite spiritual beings, for example, human souls or angels, are present, while repletive presence describe the way in which an infinite spiritual being, God, is present. Luther held that Jesus' body was present in the communion wafer and wine, but illocally present, whereas Calvin held that the communal wine and wafer were the blood and body of Christ if and only if they were received as an act of faith from a true believer or from a community of true believers. For Calvin, the Holy Spirit, or the bond between believers, is a mechanism that delivers Christ's body, that makes it possible that Christ could be both present in the wafer and still up there in the clouds or in heaven.
What is Christianity?
What is Christianity?
It's the Holy Spirit.
It's the Holy Spirit.
What is the Holy Spirit?
What is the Holy Spirit?
It's an egalitarian community of believers
It's an egalitarian community of believers
who are linked by love for each other
who are linked by love for each other
and who only have their own freedom and responsibility to do it.
and who only have their own freedom and responsibility to do it.
In this sense,
In this sense,
the Holy Spirit is here now,
the Holy Spirit is here now,
and down there on Wall Street,
and down there on Wall Street,
there are pagans who are worshipping blasphemous idols.
there are pagans who are worshiping blasphemous idols.
So we can see that Goodwin's Calvinism was, from the start, radical, and he aimed to follow in his father's footsteps and become a nonconformist minister. Later on, Goodwin's abandonment of Christianity, his atheism and anarchism, his critique of private property, and his insistence that all people deserve not just those goods they need to survive, but wealth, leisure, and the time to pursue their own individual intellectual curiosity. All this developed out of his Calvinism, and this Calvinism was a product of the Reformation, which of course was a religious upheaval brought on by the corruption of the clergy, the dissatisfaction of the laymen, the cultural and economic changes the invention of the printing press engendered, and so on. Goodwin is considered to be a prototypical anarchist, but he was profoundly anti-political and individualist. He believed that the best society would be one run by the rational judgment of a community of independent producers. He was overall hostile to taxation, the redistribution of the wealth, and to the state. Goodwin was born into the middle class. His wife, the feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, had the same class background. and today they are both most well known as the parents of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. There can be no denying Goodwin's place in the history of socialism, and no denying his influence on Marx, however.
What are ghosts? And why do they keep repeating the same actions over and over again? One theory is that a haunting is a violent release of energy, somehow frozen in space and time.
Let's look at the French Utopians that Ader mentioned: Charles Fourier, Henri de Saint-Simon, and Etienne Cabet. According to Roger Payton, in an essay he wrote for the journal Utopian Studies in 2002, Marx and Engels considered these early socialists to be a somewhat confused bunch, as they argued for socialism based on a rationalist faith in science with a radical critique of individualism. This, along with their shared commitment to the satisfaction of human needs as the highest goal of life and of society, their belief in the power of science and social science to clarify human nature, and their shared method of prefigurative experimentation defines this utopian strand of socialism. And while Emile Ader was certainly right to include these thinkers in his list of influences on Marxist communism, we should understand that Marx and Engels' attitude towards these utopians was similar to their attitude towards capitalism itself. In his essay, The Peasant War in Germany, Engels wrote, "We will never forget that we stand on the shoulders of Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, three men who, despite their utopianism, anticipated with genius countless matters whose accuracy we now demonstrate scientifically." And Marx, too, spoke highly of the Utopians, claiming that they attacked every principle of existing society and are hence full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. However, they both also saw the Utopians as conceiving of human nature and morality within the frame of the then burgeoning capitalist society. These socialists were bourgeois despite themselves, as they conceived of elites who would impose a moral and more equitable order upon the masses. They spoke of justice, redistribution, and equality, and thereby reproduced the very framework they sought to overcome. Further, the Utopians believed that a better world could be achieved without struggle, that reason and persuasion would be the tools used to transform society, and that the world to be achieved would be harmonious and thereby static, rather than dynamic, revolutionary, and free. Fourier, in particular, was against the idea of revolution. According to Robert Bowles for his essay, The Reaction of Charles Fourier to the French Revolution, written for the Duke University journal French Historical Studies, Fourier's revolutionary baptism of fire at the age of 21 was a tragic experience which left him bitter and resentful. Fourier's rejection of the French Revolution, his horror after witnessing the terror in 1793, brought him to reject the Enlightenment and really the whole of the philosophical tradition. In his book, The Theory of the Four Movements, Fourier wrote, "Since the philosophers demonstrated their ineptitude in their attempt to put ideas into practice in the French Revolution, everybody has agreed in regarding their science as an aberration of the human mind. Having taken 25 centuries to perfect their theories, and having brought together the whole of ancient and modern wisdom, they begin by creating as many calamities as they promise benefits, and lead civilized society back towards a state of barbarism." Rather than follow in the tradition of the old philosophers, Fourier chose to follow his own path towards a new sort of science, largely one of his own invention. In his theory of the four movements, he claimed, in a footnote, that a large comet the size of Jupiter would take up a position between the Sun and Jupiter. This would cause such an upset to the order of the solar system that the Earth would become one of Jupiter's moons, and would also gain 5 more moons of its own in the bargain. In another entertaining footnote, Fourier wrote that after the socialist movement took hold, the seeds would be the flavor of a kind of lemonade, and that new technologies would make it easy to remove the saline and citric particles from the water and render it drinkable. The standard Marxist line on the French Utopians is that theirs represented a principled and often helpful reaction to the failures of the bourgeois revolution and the proletarianization of France. As the proletariat class emerged in Europe, the Utopian Socialists conceived of what was happening as the immiseration of an unruly mob. And for the sake of creating a good life for all people, and in an effort to mitigate the risk of another violent revolution, they made their proposals and ran their experiments. As Ader closed out his first chapter on communism, he referred to these early socialists in order to make a distinction between them and the later communists, and in order to demonstrate the difference between socialism and communism. He wrote, "In the first place, socialism's religio-moral disposition marks it as distinctly different from the purely materialistic base on which communism stands. According to Ader, the socialists saw morality as essential, as the force that directed men's lives, and they saw the good life rightly lived as the ultimate goal of socialist movements. Communists, on the other hand, saw material satisfaction as an end in itself. This characterization amounts to a mischaracterization of at least Marx, because for Marx, the material basis that directs human life is itself a product of our social relations. And communism would not just be a society where everyone's bellies were full. That wasn't what Marx aimed at. But rather, a communist world would be one in which we could be responsible for ourselves and our material conditions. The aim was not just material satisfaction, but the freedom to change and even experiment with the social relations that shape our material conditions and our self-understanding. Ader's second distinction between socialism and communism has to do with methodology. Marx's communism is dedicated to revolutionary violence, while socialists like Fourier are committed to nonviolent and reasonable movements to formulate new kinds of communities. Ader's third point of difference between socialism and communism deserves a video all to itself, and I am going to make one later on. What he claims is that for communists, all private property has to be abolished, whereas socialists believed in something more like a mixed economy. I think this way of framing the difference between socialism and communism leads to more confusion than clarity, and I'll return to this, along with the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the next video. In the first video in this series, I ended with a promise to tackle the anarchist Proudhon next, and I didn't do it this time, and I won't do it next time, but I will eventually. Proudhon and Marx's critique of Proudhon are so important that I want to settle this question of private property so that we can then understand the man Proudhon and why Marx considered him to be both a friend and an enemy. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.